begin with a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. It says this: "Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, let us be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or good or beautiful makes much sense in any immediate context of history." In other words, some of the work we have in our faith, in our trauma, healed through many generations, work that is done through the church and in our world and in our society takes time. And we have the tremendous chance to build and to work for those goals that we may never see. In 1 Corinthians 12, we continue with what we started last week, which was the manifestation of the Spirit through the gifts of the Spirit that were, though through one Spirit, many gifts. Many gifts, many people, many quirks, idiosyncrasies, many people, many tribes, all through the work and the power of the Spirit. And so today we ask the question, to what end? To what end are those gifts given, or for what purpose? And we have a resounding answer in 1 Corinthians. It's simply to lift one another up. As Paul writes earlier in 1 Corinthians 12:7, it is the gifts of the Spirit to work for the common good. To further the point, 1 Corinthians says that we are connected. Deeply, intimately connected. So much so that to lift up one part of the body is to even lift up ourselves. As one suffers, so another suffers. For Paul, we, the church, and I'd like to extend Paul's circle to include the greater social sphere that we live in, are deeply connected, one to another. That, at least, is Paul's imagination of how we, as people, operate. As we, as a people, prioritize and consider. That is, we consider the needs of another. But we know that's not always the case. Scripture's imagination is sometimes just that, Scripture's imagination. Jesus' words are sometimes just that, Jesus' words to captivate and liberate those who are oppressed and move forward. We recognize that we're still quite some distance from the reality in which we operate and the imagination that Scripture gives us. And it begs the question, how connected are we really? It's an important question to ask, as we who live in America wrestle with questions like, what do we share in common? Where does my right end and another's begins? What will I sacrifice for the common good? Does anyone still believe in the common good, let alone is willing to sacrifice something for it? Now, some of you may already know the name Martin Shkreli already. Martin became quite infamous fairly recently, and I'll explain why. Some years ago, Martin began as a hedge fund manager and quickly learned how to bet on biotech companies. Not only did he learn how to bet on biotech companies in fact failing, he recognized that he could in fact influence the failing of a company. How? Through social media. He recognized that if he could in fact sully the waters, dirty the waters, that he could determine and dictate some of the future of this company's profits. He later, along with significant investors, started a company called Turing Pharmaceuticals. Now, you may not know this, but Turing Pharmaceuticals actually spent $55 million to acquire the sole right to sell a drug called Daraprim. Luckily, I do not know and did not know what Daraprim was. And you may not either, but suffice it to say that it is on the World Health Organization's top 100 list of necessary medications. What is it? It deals with and treats an infection that can cause, it's a parasitic infection, that causes great birth defects in unborn babies and significant problems, in fact, even to the point of death, for those who are immunocompromised, meaning those who are battling AIDS or cancer. At the time Torii Pharmaceuticals purchased the rights to sell Daraprim, the cost of a single dose was $13.50. Once Martin and Torii Pharmaceuticals acquired the sole right to sell and distribute, the price raised to $750 a pill. It was a 5,000% markup. How connected are we? In his defense, Martin articulated what feels like a capitalist cry, which is this, he said. No one likes to admit it, but this is the system we live in. It's a capitalist system with capitalist rules. My investors expect me to maximize profits, not to minimize them. And so he was justified. A 5,000% market. What happens with those decisions? Common good, social connections begin to fray. Social trust, the trust in one another, in the good that we all share and that someone is looking out, begins to fray. Not to belabor the point, but to illustrate it maybe a little further, a significant shift, in fact, in America's corporate culture let Martin and Torii Pharmaceuticals increase the price of Daraprim. This shift has been known as the shift from stakeholder to shareholder. Now, the stakeholder was the hallmark of the 1950s America's corporate culture. According to Robert Wright in his book, The Common Good, much of this shift from stakeholder to shareholder took place in the 80s and the 90s. How? Well, as companies began to be flipped by what were called corporate raiders. Corporate raiders would flip a business, much like flipping a house. However, in flipping a house, of course, you're going to improve and invest in that house. You're going to put on a new roof, fix a leaky faucet, you're going to put in new granite countertops, invest in the bathrooms and the kitchens, that's what they say. Now, there are, of course, downsides to this investment. Generally, gentrification happens. As home prices begin to rise, others begin to sell. But flipping a business, you don't invest in the business, you actually divest. So what did these corporate raiders do? Well, they began to slash everything. Salaries, pensions, personnels. How and why? To bloat the bottom line. To raise the stock prices, show massive returns to the shareholders, sell, and then go do the same thing. And what about the stakeholders? It's not even a common word, I would say, stakeholder. We don't even use that in our vernacular anymore. The employees, the city, the environment, the surrounding businesses, well, it's a winner-take-all proposition which still dictates much of our norms for corporations, for politicians, how we govern ourselves. Indeed, many sins have been perpetrated under the guise of what's known as fiduciary responsibility. And so fractures and fragmentation begin to fray. So how connected are we really? Well, for Torii Pharmaceuticals, not very. For corporate raiders, very little, if anything. But thanks be to God that you and I also get to determine how connected we are. Robert Reich, in the book The Common Good, underscores some of the fragmentation that we're beginning to experience in our society. A lost sense of civility and decency. A lost sense of a shared trust, almost to the point where we expect folks to take advantage, and we feel a license to do the same. He says that we've entered into a political, economic, and even educational mode of operations called win at all costs. Whether it's the lies politicians say or leaders say and are willing to say to save themselves, or even the belief that's shifting, that is that education is a private investment that demands an individual return, is a reflection of this shift away from the common good. At one point, education was, of course, to build up a citizenry of informed people. Today, it's what is in it for me. In the short run, he claims this strategy may provide temporary gains for the victors, but it comes at a cost. The cost is our shared national and social fabric, the collective trust that we have in one another. To put this within the metaphor of 1 Corinthians, not only is the foot neglecting the needs of the eye, the foot is quite literally damaging the eye to benefit itself. Beyond that, the foot is even bringing into question whether the body is actually connected at all. Now, as Christians who imbibe this message in Luke 4, that Jesus came to liberate the captives, to set them free, and declare the year of the Lord's favor, and who also hear echoes of that same teaching in Paul, who would say, members of the body that were weak are indispensable, are to be built up even more. We already know how connected we are, that we share a responsibility for one another, that as one suffers, so another suffers along beside of him. And UBC, you do that in spades. But I know many folks even go too far with that, losing their own sense of self, losing their own well-being at the protection of another. No, we each are part of the body, and we each have value, and we each have need. One member does not do well without the other. So what's left to be done? How do we begin to knit this fabric back together? In 2016 or so, I started picking up the habit of sewing. I had never sewed before. Katie, my partner, had asked for a sewing machine some time ago for Christmas. I don't think she had ever used it except to sew, I think, some curtains maybe at one point. And it sat there. And at the time, I had a little bit of time on my hands, so I decided to make Christmas pajamas. So I went about getting a pattern. I went to the store, picked out a red and green kind of fabric, a felt fabric that I thought would look nice. I measured everything that I thought I would do. This was, of course, my first venture. And pretty soon the Christmas pajamas became Christmas shorts because I didn't buy enough fabric. And the elastic that was supposed to be expandable, pretty soon, I didn't know that you weren't supposed to sew through the elastic. And so I literally sewed the elastic that you're supposed to expand and contract with it, and I sewed it all shut. So it was one uniform. Nobody could wear the shorts, the Christmas shorts. And all of them started to fray easily within, I don't know, a month of washing. I guess my son, Oliver, was able to wear some of the shorts. And so I went to knitting things back together. And I do think that's part of our work as leaders, as Christians, as people of God, to begin sewing, to begin knitting together some of that social fabric. And how do we do it? Number one, through honesty. Trust must be the utmost import of Christians, of our society, in fact. that shared collective trust needs to be restored, that water needs to be put back in. Trust and honesty must be the fabric. We must also demand it. Demand it from our leaders. Demand it from our politicians, our CEOs. Honesty must be a part of the fabric of how we interact as a people. Secondly, I'd like to say that our images of status need to change. What does status look like? Growing up, I knew what status looked like. Not because my parents had told me one way or the other what status meant, but because I picked up on small cues. For instance, I had one uncle who was quite well off. And every time we spoke of this uncle, it was followed by your uncle who does very well for himself. Or we're going to your uncle's house. Oh, it's beautiful. I didn't have a message of what status meant, but I knew that status meant wealth. And I think we've sort of imbibed that, in a sense. Paul's image of status is a body that functions in unison, a body that supports one another, a body that lifts up. Jesus' imagination of status is to seek the well-being of those who can't seek it for themselves. I think the closer we get to Jesus' imagination, to Paul's imagination, to imagination that pushes the boundaries of status to include the needs of the hand and the feet, and the arm and the elbow and the eye and the wrist, and my neighbor, all of a sudden we'll begin to see a flourishing. But of course, it's going to take time. We've heard songs of the body in unison. Frank Asher reminded us, too, of the body at work is the living spirit of Christ. But my friends, it will take time. So I'll conclude with the quote that I began with from Reinhold Niebuhr. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, let us be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or good or beautiful makes much sense in any immediate context of history. In other words, let your imagination run wild. In other words, game on, take breaks, refresh yourself, and we have some work to do.